Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 100th episode of the Writ podcast. And who better to join me for this milestone episode than my good friend Aaron Wherry of the CBC. Aaron, how you doing?
It's an honor and a privilege to be here on this historic occasion.
It really is. So I hope you appreciate it that I gave the spot to you. Okay, so this is the summer recess of Parliament. We're now 2 years into Justin Trudeau's third mandate. This is really the halfway point if it lasts until 2025. So it is a good time to do a little bit of stock taking of where things stand. So why don't we do that? We'll start with the Liberals. So they have made it halfway through this term, which isn't common for a minority government, but with the confidence and supply agreement that the Liberals have with the New Democrats, it's a bit of an uncommon situation. But there's been talk of a cabinet shuffle coming. It's been a rough couple of months for the government. Are they in need of a reset right now?
Well, it's funny because last summer we were talking about how they needed a reset. And so if they're doing one already, another reset again, then that suggests the first one didn't take. I mean, I think they're in a kind of a funny position because they had a really, if you didn't know, if the by-elections hadn't occurred and all you had to go on was the polling and sort of the basic, observations of how the spring went, you would have said they've had a really rough first half of the year, right? The foreign interference thing has sucked up so much oxygen. It's been so difficult for them. They had to, David Johnston had to leave. They're still trying to kind of get out from under it. It's been pretty rough for them, and the polling, as you pointed out recently, is starting to sort of trend towards the Conservatives, or show at least kind of a small Conservative lead. And so you would think that just based on those kind of data points, you would say, well, they're in pretty rough shape. But then those by-elections have happened, along with the Mississauga Lakeshore by-election, and they haven't picked up any seats, but they've in Mississauga and then in Winnipeg, they've increased their lead over the Conservatives in those two elections, or by-elections, or two ridings. And they, came pretty weirdly close in Oxford, maybe because of, one-off circumstances, but nonetheless, and they did fairly well in Westmount. So it's, on the one hand, it doesn't look like they had the best start to the year, and it doesn't look like they're sort of trending in the right direction. But the by-election suggests that it's not quite as bad for them as maybe it seems. And there's at least some, kind of bedrock support for them that it seems to be holding, or at least, I guess to look at it from the other direction, the Conservatives aren't yet eating their lunch. Pierre Poilievre isn't sweeping the country. And so that in that sense, they're maybe not as bad off as they could be or might be thought to be. But at the same time, it does feel like, now is a time to kind of to look at the cabinet again, figure out who's not performing well, figure out who maybe could be put in an even more prominent position, and then make those changes, especially because you have to assume that some people either aren't going to run for re-election or, aren't really in the government's plans long term. And so here's a chance to elevate some people and make some strategic moves that put the government in a better place to, kind of carry through, not only the last half of this year, but presumably, if you assume the confidence and supply agreement is going to hold through 2024, which would kind of be the pre-election year.
Would it be a bit dangerous, though, for them to look at those by-election results and look at the kind of situation in the polls where they're behind? The latest polls do tend to put them behind. There's now and then you'll have a poll that comes out with them tied with the Conservatives, but generally they're behind. Would it be kind of dangerous to be like, well, it's not as bad as it could have been this far into the mandate, and when you look at the headlines over the last few months, would they be kind of fooling themselves to think that maybe we can just kind of white knuckle this for another couple of years?
Yeah, definitely, right? Like if the by-elections kind of push back on what might be the sort of popular media narrative that the Liberals are in a lot of trouble, or sort of reinforces the idea that maybe the next election isn't fully decided at this point, the Liberals would be incredibly foolish to look back on the first 6 months and say, things are fine, we're flying here. It's not that things are they're sort of cruising to re-election. It's that they've still got a chance, and that chance is going to rest a lot on execution and how well they perform as a government. And they can't really, they need as few springs like they've just had, stretches like this between now and the next election as possible, right? Like, it wasn't, the foreign interference situation was handled badly. The Bernardo situation was handled badly. There were, all these little revelations about, messages not getting up to the right ministers, and communication breaking down, and if they want to get reelected, there's sort of a two-part argument. One is the other guy's bad, and you don't want him to be in government, and the other part is we're doing pretty well, so let's stick with this. And they might be, I think they're sort of more comfortable at this point making the argument that Pierre Poilievre is bad, but they need the other part of the argument. They need to be able to mount a positive argument for themselves. And if they can't, they can't count on, Justin Trudeau, the sheer sort of, they can't count on the kind of Justin Trudeau appeal that he had in 2015. Then they need to have the appeal of the government's doing okay, the country's doing okay, we still have better ideas, and we're headed in the right direction. And I don't think, based on the spring, you would necessarily say that they're making that argument very well.
What would be the next 2 years for them? Because it feels, 2 years is not a long time, but it also is a long time when you think about it in terms of like an election coming. If there is a shuffle, even is it a bit early to be putting in the team that's for the next election, because you still have an entire year of legislation to try to push through? What does the next 2 years for the Liberals look like? Because it's not exactly clear to me, and it's probably one of the issues that they're grappling with, and why they might not be doing as well in the polls as they could be. But it's not exactly clear to me what they're going to do over the next 2 years.
Yeah, so I guess part of it is, I think, just finishing off the confidence and supply agreement, right? The dental care program still needs to be implemented. There are still, I think, a half dozen items in there that haven't been sort of checked off the list. There are some loose ends to tie up from the spring. Child care legislation is in the Senate. They've got to get that passed. The filling out, Trudeau is very big on the idea of, Canada being sort of the world's, most reliable supplier of, I can't remember how you phrase it, most reliable supplier of clean tech and clean energy in a net zero world. That sort of agenda needs to be filled out. But I think you're right that there does start to be a point where they need to start kind of introducing some new ideas, some new energy, some new initiatives, which is kind of a funny thing to say, because they're so far into their time in office. It's almost hard to imagine a government in their 8th year or 9th year having new ideas, and there's almost definitely a risk of introducing new ideas when they haven't seemed to quite finish off the agenda they promised in the last 3 elections. But they are going to have to, they definitely can't go into the next election saying, well, our work here is done, so just elect us and we'll kind of keep things, we'll kind of maintain order. There's going to have to be some kind of new, additions to the agenda. And, so maybe that comes out in part from bringing new people into cabinet. But you're also right that even if they bring in a cabinet in July, you're hardly guaranteed that all those ministers are going to make it to 2025. But they do, you can see places where they need a refresh, right? Like with all due respect to him, Marco Mendicino in public safety, it just feels like I can't think of a time when a minister has been sort of more clearly tagged for being moved. And there are things like that they can do, that they need to kind of bring some new energy in and bring some new faces in.
Yeah, we'll see how much of a shuffle it's going to be. If it's going to be a wholesale one, some major portfolios kind of moving around, or if it is just a bit more of this kind of nip and tuck kind of shuffle, which is the kind of shuffle you often see, I guess, ahead of an election when it's just the last little ones. But if you can remember back, of course, in 2019, sometimes these little shuffles end up revealing something a lot bigger underneath that becomes a problem.
Yeah, and so they have to, I can't remember who it was who I heard say this to me once, but like the prime ministers get into trouble when they take cabinet shuffles and try to get creative. And the famous, Scott Bryson's leaving, so let's make some changes, cabinet shuffle in 2019 was one of those cases where they decided to get creative and it ended badly. I don't know that they necessarily need to blow things up, right? Like, I suspect a lot of the major portfolios are kind of set. I don't think Chrystia Freeland's going to cease being finance minister. I don't think Melanie Joly is moving anywhere from foreign affairs. Anita Anand at defense is probably set. There are a bunch of like sort of major portfolios that are probably fine, but this is a chance to sort of clear out problems and find some new people who, either they individually politically need a boost, or they could present, a bit more energy into government. And those are the kind of moves that I think they could make this time. But then, even that, like, there's going to be a lot of focus on the cabinet shuffle, but the spring suggests that this government just needs to be, if they want to get reelected, they have to be better at just functioning internally and just generally managing the business of government. And I don't know that that's necessarily just a matter of switching cabinet portfolios. It does feel like this government, going back to last summer, one of the things they came away from that experience was, they'd had all these problems with service delivery and passports and so on. And they came out of that experience saying, well, we really need to renew our focus on just competence, on just being competent and just delivering government services and handling the business of government. And it really feels like they haven't quite gotten a handle on that part of it. And simply changing the faces of government, I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to fix it.
I got one question from Mark Roy. He was asking whether there was an issue from the first 2 years of the Trudeau mandate of this mandate that are probably still going to be election issues if we're going back to 2025. The foreign interference file is a bit of a wild card because we don't know how long this is going to stretch out, whether it is going to be a public inquiry or not, and that could be something that takes a long time. There's the issues like you mentioned, the passport ones, the competency issues, I think, are probably something that might hold on and be an issue in 2025 if the Conservatives are trying to make a case for a change. But is there anything over the first 2 years you think that are still going to matter when we get to the 4-year mark, if we make it that long?
So I don't know that the foreign interference issue necessarily on its own is going to be the thing. But I think the Conservatives have decided that the Prime Minister's ethics or trustworthiness is an issue, and they're going to hammer it as long as they can. And then I think the other piece is climate change, which is obviously not a controversy necessarily, but the Conservatives have not only not stopped attacking the government's climate record, they've arguably, kind of continued to double down on the idea that the carbon tax and the clean fuel regulations are a bad policy and are costing Canadians too much money. And I suspect at this point, it really does feel like the Conservatives are set on going into the next election, fighting those battles. And it remains to be seen whether Pierre Poilievre's, what his own climate agenda will look like, or his platform commitments will look like. But I think that, all along as the foreign interference thing was happening, the Conservatives were still grinding away on cost of living and inflation and housing and building the kind of climate piece into that to say, look, all these Canadians are facing, high housing costs and a cost of living crisis, and you're just piling on more and more costs with your climate policies. I think that what you're hearing now is probably pretty close to what you'll hear in 2025.
Just watching the Nanos polling that you see every week in terms of issue polling, the environment is still sticking up there, right? So if inflation does go down by the next couple of years, then there's a pretty good chance the environment could end up being almost the default top issue by the time we get to the next election. You did mention the Conservatives, so let's move on to them. They had their by-election results, which were not particularly stellar. They dropped a lot of support in Oxford, as you mentioned. It might have been a bit of the internal dynamics, but even that is a bit of a symptom of a potential problem that could become a bigger problem in the next election, because they are going to have to fill out a lot of nominations across the country. And if you have more of these kinds of internal fights, that could be pretty embarrassing. But dropping a lot in Winnipeg South Centre, which is a seat they won in 2011. It's not really a seat that Poilievre needs to win the most seats, probably the kind of seat he needs to win a majority government. So there was some questions about whether those by-elections, Mississauga Lakeshore again was another case, that when it comes to time to actually vote, the Conservatives are not doing as well as their fundraising numbers suggest, some of the polls suggest. How are things looking for Pierre Poilievre when he's now approaching the first full year of his leadership, and he's finished now an entire political season now as the leader of the Conservative Party?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the by-elections, so the positive case, the things that the Conservatives could point to with sort of optimism would be, Maxime Bernier didn't break through in Portage-Lisker. Yes, he still got whatever it was, 17, 18%, but that's not 25 or 30%, which, would have been, if Bernier had gotten 25, 30%, we would have been talking about, look at this show of strength. This, the People's Party is for real. What does this mean? You can look at Oxford and say, well, it's just a one-off. By-elections can be weird. Local issues can pop up. I remember, before 2015, the Liberals came very close to winning Brandon Souris. That didn't exactly forecast into the future. So you can look at that and kind of explain, well, it's not a bad spring for the Conservatives. They also had the Liberals on the defensive over foreign interference for months. But the results in places like Winnipeg and Mississauga make you wonder whether they're still not breaking through to the voters they need to win, if not a majority, then at least the most seats. And whether, as much as people might be tired of the Liberals, as much as they might kind of like to see some kind of different approach at the federal level, that they're just not willing to go to the Conservatives and make that the different approach. And that's a problem, I think, for the Conservatives. And I don't quite know how they're going to bridge that gap. It seems like their philosophy is, they can sort of pull back some of the vote from the People's Party, and then, they can hope that the Liberal vote will drop far enough, or that they can scoop up just enough of sort of those suburban votes to kind of put the Conservatives over the top. And it looks like maybe the first part of that calculation is working, but it doesn't quite look like the second part of that calculation is working. And when you look at Poilievre's personal numbers, they aren't great. The negatives are pretty high for a guy who is a new leader and hasn't really been around for a long time. It sure looks like he has a bit of an image problem with the public, and those are pretty big weaknesses, right? If you're losing by bigger margins in places like Winnipeg and Mississauga, what exactly is the path to government? And so I think that makes it, Poilievre's kind of future or how he'll perform in an election, I think is the big open question right now. Whatever happens in the polls between now and 2025, what happens when it's a 5-week campaign and Canadians have to decide who they're going to vote for. At that point, as much as people are unhappy with the Liberals or are interested in change, do they stick with the Liberals because there's some problem, some issue they have with Poilievre where they're just not ready to make that leap?
In the polls that we've seen, where the Conservatives are now, in some of the surveys, 35, 37% sometimes, a lot of the support that they've been picking up is in places where they don't really need it, right? So it is in Alberta and then the prairies, and they're doing a little bit better in Ontario, but it's still a really close race in Ontario, so that you're looking at best case scenario, the Conservatives can pick up 20, 25 seats, maybe be able to form a minority government, depending on how the other kind of dynamics work out with the other parties. But the strategy that you mentioned, knock down the PBC vote and hope to get enough Liberals either to stay home or whatever, it's hard to see whether it's working or not, because the PBC vote in the polls is more or less holding at 3-4%, whatever. But in the by-elections that we saw, Oxford was a good case of that. The PPC got over 10% of the vote in Oxford last time. Southwestern Ontario was a place where there was a lot of support for the PPC, anti-vax kind of stuff. Their support just tanked in Oxford, where they weren't putting in any effort. But the Conservative vote didn't go up, right? So a lot of that went to the Liberals because of the nomination dynamics, maybe. But you start to wonder whether that strategy really works, because a lot of that PPC vote is probably going to just stay home rather than vote for the Conservatives, because a lot of them were kind of anti-establishment people to begin with. And the Conservatives kind of need the NDP to be doing badly. And the Conservatives are also going after the NDP, right? Because they need to get some of that blue-collar support that Doug Ford was able to get. It starts to become a pretty tricky thing to pull off if you can't knock the Liberals down a lot.
Yeah, and like by all means, the Liberal margin for error has really shrunk over the last 3 elections, right? Their vote has fallen, not just in terms of percentage, but in absolute numbers, it's fallen, and they can't really afford to have it fall much further. But if the Conservatives are counting on it falling much further, they might be miscalculating, because it just doesn't seem to be happening. I think if you like. Again, I don't want to make too much of a couple by-elections, but like you would think that a government in its, going into its 8th year, or in its 8th year rather, if people were clamoring for change, if people were really fed up with this government and really interested in the alternative, you would see that somehow in places like Mississauga and Winnipeg, or at least, one of the two, and you don't see it. And so, if the Conservatives are kind of sitting around waiting for the Liberals to defeat themselves, it's not quite clear that that's going to happen, or that the Liberal vote is necessarily going to flee just because or flee to the Conservatives, or flee in general just because people aren't super interested in Trudeau anymore. As I said earlier, like the Liberals still have to make a positive argument for themselves. If you ask me at this moment, who's most likely to come out of the next election with the most seats, based just kind of on the fundamentals of like a government who will have been in office for a decade and a prime minister whose personal numbers aren't so hot, I would kind of be prone to say, I'd be kind of on the side of saying the Conservatives are the odds-on favorite, but that, it's not clear, it's not a slam dunk by any stretch, and the by-elections don't suggest that that Poilievre is making huge gains on the Liberals right now. And, that I don't know whether that's going to cause the Conservatives to recalculate their strategy, but at this point, it's not obvious that the Conservative strategy is really paving the way to government.
You could see kind of both paths working out, right? Where the election starts and the Liberals just start to sink in the polls because people finally are coming to the conclusion that they've been there for a long time, kind of tired of this approach, and we're going to go elsewhere. And you can see that the Liberal numbers that they're having between elections are not able to be sustained going forward, because you get to an actual campaign and people decide at that point to switch. But you can also see the alternative where Pierre Poilievre's unfavorables, which are really high in a lot of the polls, just become a bit of an anchor for him, and he can't get above that. And some of the tactics, some of the reactions that we see from the Conservatives, particularly how they went after Max Bernier during the campaign, going over on issues on the World Economic Forum, on the fact that he was in a pride parade at some point, you can see that these tendencies, these reflexes, could become a problem on a campaign trail, and the Conservative numbers that they're putting up between campaigns, when people might be parking their vote, can't be sustained. So it is a little bit of a Schrodinger's cat kind of situation where you don't really know what's going to happen until the campaign begins. Yeah,
and I think, a couple things there. Like, one is we know campaigns can matter, right? Go back to 2015. Trudeau was, if memory serves, running third. Now, obviously, they'd done pretty well in polls before that, but there was all this focus on how's Trudeau going to hold up in a campaign. The Conservatives seemed to calculate that he was not going to hold up well, and he was going to sort of wilt under the pressure, and the opposite thing happened, and the Liberals won. So I think there's a big question of how will Poilievre do in a campaign, and how will the public react to seeing him that sort of up close and paying that much attention. And then the other piece of it is the attacks on Bernier. There is the sort of very real possibility that in focusing the efforts they've made to kind of drive down the People's Party of Canada vote are just going to end up like hurting them on the other end. And that's a very real possibility, and it's possible that that's what we're already seeing. And so I'm interested, I guess, to a certain degree, to see at this point whether the Conservatives think, okay, we've driven the People's Party vote down enough, we've sort of warded off the threat of Bernier, and now do they kind of try to, I don't know, pivot's not the right word, but does Pierre Poilievre stop talking about the World Economic Forum, at least for a while, to try to rebuild or build up some support on the other end? Because I don't know that they can do both at the same time. I don't know that you can sort of wage a campaign against the People's Party of Canada and wage a campaign for the general electorate simultaneously.
Yeah, the question for me is whether it's a deliberate strategy or just Poilievre kind of being Poilievre, right? This is where he would go naturally if the PPC didn't even exist, and I don't know if we have a real answer to that. So we'll have to wait and see. Okay, let's finish up with the NDP. Their interest in maintaining the confidence and supply agreement still seems pretty high. Their by-election results are really awful, but I think people are making a bit too much of that, because I think the NDP always does badly in by-elections where they're not a factor. So I always kind of assume they're going to do pretty poorly. So I don't really put it as a knock against them exactly. But nevertheless, we're not seeing any signs that there's a big orange wave coming for the New Democrats. So they seem pretty happy to keep this going until 2025.
I mean, I think so. I mean, it doesn't look like they have any political reason to do it. Now, it's always possible the Liberals could sort of put them in that position, right, by either stumbling into a scandal or behaving so obnoxiously that the NDP says we have to walk away from this. And I think
sort of like they did 1974, right?
Yeah. I mean, in that case, it was very deliberate by the Liberals. I mean, I don't even know if it has to be deliberate. I think like something like foreign interference, if the Liberals had continued to be very obstinate about calling an inquiry, the NDP could have found itself in a position where it just had to make an uncomfortable decision and walk away. But I do think at this point, it still makes more sense for the NDP to keep going in this deal, to build up some policy successes and things they can point to in the next election to say, if we didn't exist, if we weren't there, that this wouldn't have happened. They're still attacking the government with glee on a regular basis. So it's not like they've been completely docile, but they do, I think, for this deal to work for them to be able to go to the electorate and say, vote for us, they need to be able to say, by us being in Parliament, this is what happened, and we got this done and this done and this done. And pulling the plug only limits the number of things they can point to. And to a certain extent, they need that Liberal vote to collapse, right? The NDP needs to somehow become the progressive option. And I think that's hard. It's not that it hasn't happened before, right? In 2011, it happened in the middle of the campaign. So it's possible. I think it's hard. And I think the other problem they have is that outside of sort of urban progressive circles, they have to worry about the Conservatives. And I think you've seen the NDP focus more of its attention on Poilievre and on pointing out that Poilievre, is in their view isn't this working class hero. He's not there for the common man, as he says. They've started making that argument more often, and I think they need to make that argument. I think the danger for them is that it gets squeezed, right? That the Conservatives eat some of their lunch in places like Timmins, James Bay. And meanwhile, the Liberals in a campaign get to say, it's either us or the Conservatives. And if you're voting for the NDP, you could end up with Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister. The same old argument that's, time immemorial for Liberals, but in this case, maybe it works even more effectively. And the NDP gets squeezed. But I think, that's an argument, that's a problem that they will probably face one way or another, or a challenge they'll face one way or another. I think the best, not that they need my advice, but it still seems like the best path forward is for them to stick with this deal and try to be able to say at next election, we actually got stuff done. We weren't just opposing. We weren't just sitting occupying 25 seats or whatever it is in Parliament, we made this happen. We made dental care happen. We made, this and this happen. And here's what else we would do if there were even more of us there. That's still the best argument they have. And so for all of the kind of questions about, are you going to stick with it? Are you not? Is this a confidence issue? Are you going to walk away? Is this a deal breaker? It still, in the long run, seems to make more sense to me to stick with that deal.
Yeah, the best case scenario, realistic scenario for the NDP at this stage would seem to be if they can win 30, 35 seats and the Liberals win enough that is enough that the two of them continue governing for a little while, and the NDP can get even more things. And, we've said it many times, but the NDP leaders that are remembered the most are the ones who were able to get things in minority parliaments, right? So for Jagmeet Singh, that's not a bad result. Just we'll close quickly on this one. It was a question I got from Ian Carter. Olivia Chow just won in Toronto. Obviously, NDP background, history there, an MP for a long time. Is that a good news or bad news for the NDP in Toronto? Because on the one hand, maybe a sign of a progressive strength. On the other hand, if Olivia Chow is unpopular by 2025, maybe it saps the NDP a little bit.
Yeah, it's a classic, let's see how she governs and how well that works out. Because, yeah, you're right. If she comes in and does a bunch of popular things and seems to get popular results, the NDP will be able to point to that. They were already yesterday. They sent out an email fundraising off. Look at Olivia Chow's win. This is what what New Democrats can do. Blah blah blah. At the same time, the Prime Minister was near Toronto yesterday and was asked about it, and he talked about how great it was to see another strong progressive leader in Toronto. So, I'm sure Trudeau is going to be eager to show that he can work with Olivia Chow to get results. It really depends on the execution at this point, right? Because you can imagine that if Olivia Chow is mayor and things in Toronto get worse, if there's a crime wave, if housing prices continue to be out of control, Pierre Poilievre will be more than happy to point to that and say, look, this is what happens when you have progressives in charge. Chaos and disorder ensue. Whereas, both the NDP and the Liberals will probably be very eager to kind of be able to say, look at, if she succeeds, we'll be able to say, look at what progressive government can do. So I think it really depends on the execution, and trying to guess how that's going to play out is really hard to do, but it will have some effect one way or the other, right? John Tory was such a non-political entity. He just was so kind of middle of the road that it was hard to see his mayorship, whatever the word is, having much of an impact. But Olivia Chow is such a known political partisan entity that whatever happens in Toronto, the parties are going to be lining up to kind of make an argument that it supports their position one way or the other.
And the NDP targeting seats in Toronto for sure, but those are all Liberal seats. So it does... it's a complicated dance for the New Democrats wanting to make sure that they can retain some influence in the House of Commons, but not find themselves just in a minority parliament run by Pierre Poilievre, right, where they would have very little influence. So Toronto's going to end up being an interesting place to watch. And the next election in Toronto is in 2026. So there will be a federal election before the next mayoral election. So either way, Olivia Chow is going to have some impact on that vote. Okay, so it's the summertime, and I want to let you get back to the summer. I know you have big summer plans, I'm sure.
Love to spend time at the beach, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine that. You're a beach guy. Okay, so thanks so much, Aaron, and we'll talk again soon.
Anytime.